What can $10 a day really do? It buys you back your time, your peace, your future. It's not about the money. It's about the muscle, the discipline to choose your future over your present. But invest it consistently for 30 years. That's not just thousands. That's freedom. The smallest habits build the strongest foundations. Watch now the $10 a day millionaire. The profound calm that followed Clara's compounding epiphany was, like all states of grace, temporary. It was replaced by a new, more nuanced form of anxiety. The anxiety of understanding just enough to grasp the vastness of what she did not know. The quarterly statement was a thrilling data point, a single green shoe in the snow, but it raised more questions than it answered. Was her single index fund enough? Should she be diversifying into bonds, into international markets, into real estate investment trusts? The language of finance, which she had begun to decipher, now seemed to contain endless dialects and subdialects. The more she read on investing forums and financial blogs, the more contradictory the advice seemed. One school preached a hyper-aggressive, all-equities approach for the young. Another warned of impending market crashes and advocated for gold and cash. A third spoke in mystical terms about algorithmic trading and option strategies that made her head spin. The clarity she had found was clouding over, replaced by the cacophony of 1,000 conflicting voices, each claiming to hold the one true key to wealth. It was in this state of intellectual vertigo that she remembered Arthur, the retired history teacher from the personal finance workshop, the one with the kind eyes and the gentle voice that had cut through the jargon with the sharp, clean blade of common sense. He had given her his email address, scribbled on the back of a bookmark, with an open invitation to reach out with any questions. She had tucked it into her blue notebook, a potential lifeline she had been too proud, or perhaps too intimidated, to use. Now, pride felt like a ridiculous luxury. She drafted and redrafted an email a dozen times, trying to sound neither desperate nor naive, finally settling on a simple, honest message explaining her situation, her progress, and her newfound confusion. His reply came within hours, its tone as warm and measured as she remembered. "Clara," it began, "the fact that you are asking these questions means you are already ahead of 95% of investors. Confusion is the natural state of anyone who looks deeply into any complex system. The charlatans are the ones who seem to have all the answers. The wise are the ones who understand the limits of their knowledge. Let's talk. How about the botanical gardens on Saturday? The orchids are in bloom, and they are far better conversationalists than most financial pundits." That Saturday, she found him on a bench in the steamy, glass-enclosed conservatory, surrounded by a riot of tropical color and the thick, sweet scent of blooming flowers. He was exactly as she remembered, a man in his 70s, with a full head of brilliant white hair, wearing a comfortably worn corduroy jacket and reading a thick biography of Marcus Aurelius. He looked up as she approached, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a genuine smile. "Clara," he said, closing his book, "I'm glad you came. The orchids were starting to bore me with their talk of photosynthesis and proper drainage." He gestured for her to sit. "So, the market has spoken to you, and now you're wondering if you're listening correctly." She laughed, the tension already beginning to ease from her shoulders. She told him everything. The envelopes, the layoff, the IOU cards, the first thrilling sight of compounding in action, and then the subsequent flood of doubts and conflicting advice. She spoke for a long time, and he listened with the rapt attention of a natural storyteller, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "You have built the most important thing already," he said. "The behavior, the system. You have done the hard part. What you are experiencing now is what I call the paralysis of optionality. You have proven the system works, and now your mind, being an excellent problem-solving machine, is looking for more problems to solve within it. It wants to optimize, to tweak. This is where many people fail. They become day traders in their own lives, constantly buying and selling strategies, and in doing so, they erode the very discipline that brought them success." He pointed to a magnificent, speckled orchid hanging from a branch nearby. "See that plant? It doesn't try to be a rose one week and a cactus the next. It has a simple, elegant strategy. Be an orchid. It has found its niche, its required amount of light and water, and it executes that strategy with perfect consistency. Your index fund is your niche. It is a beautiful, elegant strategy. It is the be an orchid of the investing world. But shouldn't I be diversifying? Clara asked, the question that had been haunting her. Arthur smiled. You are diversified. You own 500 of the largest companies in America. That is diversification. What you're asking about is complexification. They are not the same thing. Complexity is often the enemy of returns because it introduces behavioral error. The more moving parts in your portfolio, the more tempted you will be to tinker, to second guess, to sell the thing that's doing poorly and buy the thing that's doing well, which is precisely the wrong thing to do. You are not a hedge fund manager. Your goal is not to beat the market. Your goal is to own the market and get on with your life. He then spoke about the psychology of investing, a subject Clara realized was far more important than the mechanics. The market, he said, is a device for transferring money from the impatient to the patient. It wages psychological warfare on the average investor. It preys on two emotions, greed and fear. Greed makes you buy when prices are high because everyone else is. Fear makes you sell when prices are low because everyone else is. Your system, your envelopes, your automatic investments, they're your psychological armor. They automate the process and remove the emotion. You are not buying because you feel greedy. You are buying because it is the first of the month. You are not selling because you are afraid. You are not selling at all. He talked about history, about the Great Depression, the stagflation of the 70s, the dot-com bubble, the 2008 financial crisis. In every single one of those periods, he said, the headlines screamed that the world was ending. And in every single one, those who held steady, who continued to invest in the broad market, were ultimately rewarded handsomely. The market has always recovered. It has always gone on to make new highs. Not because the world is necessarily getting better, but because human ingenuity and productivity are irrepressible forces. You are not betting on a particular company or a particular politician. You are betting on the human spirit itself. And that, my dear, has always been a good bet in the long run. They walked through the gardens for over an hour, and the conversation meandered from finance to philosophy, to history, to the simple pleasure of a well-tended garden. He didn't give her a new stock tip or a complex asset allocation model. He gave her something far more valuable, perspective. He reframed her entire journey not as a technical problem to be solved, but as a philosophical path to be walked. The goal was not just financial independence, but emotional independence from the market's daily drama. As they parted ways at the entrance, the cool outside air a shock after the humid conservatory, he placed a hand on her shoulder. You have the rarest gift an investor can have, Clara, he said. You have temperament. You have the ability to do nothing, to stay the course. All the intelligence in the world is useless without the temperament to sit quietly and let your strategy work. Don't let the noise of the world convince you to abandon your orchestra for a cacophony. On the bus ride home, Clara felt a stillness she hadn't known in weeks. The cacophony had been silenced. Arthur hadn't provided new answers. He had reaffirmed the wisdom of her original, simple plan. She saw now that her desire to diversify and optimize was just another form of the same impatience that led people to chase hot stocks. It was a lack of faith in the slow, steady, powerful process she had already set in motion. She arrived home, went straight to her desk, and opened her brokerage account. The urge to tweak her portfolio was gone. The single, boring index fund no longer looked simplistic. It looked elegant, robust, and wise. She opened her blue notebook and wrote on a fresh page, in large letters, the Orchid Strategy. Beneath it, she wrote Arthur's words. The market is a device for transferring money from the impatient to the patient. She had found more than a mentor. She had found a Sherpa for the psychological terrain of wealth building. The journey was no longer a solitary trudge. She now had a guide who had mapped these paths before, who knew where the pitfalls lay, and who understood that the greatest challenge was not in the market's fluctuations, but in the quiet, constant battle within one's own mind. The fortress of her finances now had a wise old keeper, and his name was Arthur. The years that followed Arthur's mentorship settled into a rhythm of profound, almost monastic, consistency. The initial white-knuckled intensity of Clara's financial discipline softened into a tranquil, unwavering cadence. The envelope ritual was no longer a daily battle of will. It was as natural and unthinking as breathing. The blue notebook, its cover now softened and its pages filled with years of data, was less a command center and more a logbook of a long, uneventful voyage. Her career had stabilized into a comfortable, if unremarkable, pattern of modest raises and increased responsibility at the small company. She had become a valued, reliable fixture, the person who knew where everything was and how everything worked. The shoebox apartment had become a true home, not through expensive renovations, but through the accumulated weight of memory and the careful curation of meaningful, well-made objects that brought her joy. Her life was not flashy, but it was deeply, authentically hers. The market, true to its nature, did not cooperate with a smooth, uninterrupted ascent. There were periods of stomach-churning volatility. A correction here, a pullback there. Headlines would scream about trade wars, political instability, or inflation fears, and the value of her portfolio would dip, sometimes by thousands of dollars on paper. But Clara, armored with Arthur's wisdom, had learned to see these not as catastrophes, but as seasonal storms. She remembered his words. The market is a device for transferring money from the impatient to the patient. During these downturns, she would deliberately avoid checking her account balance for days, sometimes weeks. She would focus on her work, on her walks in the park, on the simple pleasure of a book from the library. When she finally did log in, she would not look at the total gain/loss column. She would look at the shares owned column. And that number, she noted with quiet satisfaction, only ever went up, because her automatic monthly purchases continued unabated, buying more shares when prices were low. She was, as Arthur had advised, being a good orchid. Then came a period of sustained, quiet growth. The economic winds shifted, and the market began a long, steady climb. It wasn't the frantic, speculative frenzy of a bubble. It was the solid, grounded growth of a healthy economy. Clara, now in her late 30s, with more silver threads woven through her dark hair, continued her rituals. The envelopes were now transferred electronically, a modern adaptation of the physical act, but the principle was identical. The money flowed from her paycheck into her investment account and was converted into more shares of her chosen fund. She was a mere conduit for a process that had taken on a life of its own. The milestone arrived on an utterly ordinary Tuesday evening. She was 41 years old. She had just finished a simple dinner of roasted vegetables and quinoa, and was tidying up her small kitchen. There was no premonition, no sense of occasion. As part of her weekly routine, she sat down at her desk with a cup of herbal tea and opened her laptop to update her net worth spreadsheet, a practice that had evolved from the blue notebook. She logged into her brokerage account, her movements practiced and automatic. The screen loaded, and there it was, a number with a comma after the first digit. $100,412.18. She stared. She blinked. She refreshed the page. The number remained, solid and immutable. $100,000. A sum that had once seemed as distant and mythical as the mountains on the moon. A number that represented the collective weight of nearly a decade of $10 bills, of packed lunches, of walked miles, of negotiated bills, of quiet, consistent faith. She waited for the surge of euphoria, the triumphant shout, the urge to call someone and proclaim her victory. But it never came. Instead, what washed over her was a feeling so profound and unexpected that it brought quiet tears to her eyes, not of joy, but of release. It was a deep, resonant, and overwhelming peace. This was the moment the mathematics became reality. This was the moment the theory of compounding became tangible in her life. The peace was the peace of knowing, with absolute certainty, that she was no longer fragile. If she lost her job tomorrow, she had a runway of years, not weeks. A medical emergency would be an inconvenience, not a catastrophe. A major car repair would be a line item in her budget, not an existential threat. The constant, low-grade financial anxiety that had been the background static of her entire adult life, a hump she had grown so accustomed to she barely noticed it, was simply gone. The silence it left behind was deafening and beautiful. She thought back to the woman she had been at 32, crying over a spreadsheet in the blue glow of her laptop, feeling the walls of her life closing in. That woman was a stranger now. The walls were gone. In their place was open sky. The $100,000 wasn't just money. It was options. It was the concrete manifestation of her freedom. It was the power to say no to anything that did not serve her soul. It was the security to say yes to opportunities that paid less but meant more. She got up from her desk and walked to her bedroom. She opened the top drawer of the dresser. The original, physical envelope was still there, tucked away in its corner, a sacred relic. It was empty now, its purpose served, its contents having long since been transformed into this digital fortune. She picked it up, feeling the soft, warm paper. It was the most powerful object she owned. It was the seed from which this $100,000 tree had grown. She didn't call Mark. She didn't post about it on social media. This victory was too intimate, too sacred, to be diluted by outside validation or the potential for envy. This was a covenant between her past, present, and future selves. She sat for a long time in the growing darkness, not moving, just feeling the weight of this new reality settle into her bones. The number on the screen was not the goal. It was a marker, a signpost on a much longer journey. But it was the signpost that told her, unequivocally, that she was on the right path. The path was long, but she was a long-distance runner, and she had just found her second wind. The fortress was not only built, it was now fully garrisoned and provisioned. The rest of the journey was about making it a palace. The achievement of the $100,000 milestone created a curious psychological vacuum in Clara's life. For nearly a decade, that number had been a distant, shimmering beacon, a finish line she was striving toward with every fiber of her disciplined being. Now that she had crossed it, a subtle but persistent question began to whisper in the quiet corners of her mind. What now? The relentless drive that had powered her through years of austerity needed a new object, a new target. And the most readily available, most socially sanctioned target was all around her, beckoning with seductive, siren calls. Lifestyle inflation. It began subtly, as these things do. A promotion at work came with a respectable 15% raise, a sum of money that felt almost ludicrously large compared to the careful increments she was used to. The old, ingrained Clara would have automatically funneled every extra cent into her investment pipeline, tightening the system further. But the new Clara, the one with a six-figure portfolio, found herself entertaining a dangerous thought. I've earned this. The temptations were no longer about mere survival or small luxuries. They were more sophisticated, more insidious. Her reliable, decade-old hatchback, while mechanically sound, suddenly seemed embarrassingly dated next to the sleek, new hybrid models her colleagues drove. Her apartment, once a sanctuary of frugal comfort, now felt small and plain when she browsed real estate listings for airy condos with granite countertops and balcony views. A close friend from college, visiting for the weekend, remarked with well-meaning concern, "Clara, you're so successful now. You should really reward yourself. You still live like a student." The words, intended as a compliment to her asceticism, stung with the implication that she was somehow failing to live up to her own success. The world seemed to conspire to make spending feel like a moral imperative, a necessary step in the narrative of making it. Advertisements no longer targeted her with cheap deals, but with messages of deserved luxury and investment in quality. A high-end mattress store promised her the sleep she deserved. A financial advisor, who cold called her, A call she now understood was triggered by some algorithm noting her growing assets, suggested she leverage her equity to upgrade her lifestyle. It was a constant, low-grade pressure to translate her invisible, digital wealth into visible, tangible signs of status. She found herself, for the first time in years, standing in a high-end kitchenware store, running her fingers over the cool, heavy surface of a French-made enameled cast-iron pot. It cost more than her first monthly grocery budget. It was beautiful. It promised a lifetime of perfect, Instagram-worthy meals. The old calculus, this pot cost 30 envelopes, felt childish, the thinking of a person who didn't truly understand money. The new calculus was, I can afford this. Why shouldn't I have it? The calm, prosperous years had lulled the financial world into a sense of invincibility. The market's long, steady climb felt less like a cycle and more like a new, permanent state of affairs. Headlines celebrated new, all-time highs with routine exuberance. At work, colleagues who had once been cautious now spoke confidently about their stock picks and the easy money to be made. The collective psychology had shifted from prudent optimism to unshakable euphoria. Clara, watching from the sidelines, felt a familiar, cold trickle of unease. It reminded her of the quiet before her own personal storm, the false calm before her layoff. Arthur's voice echoed in her memory. The market is a device for transferring money from the impatient to the patient. The air was thick with impatience. Then, the first crack appeared. It wasn't a single event, but a cascade. A major investment bank, over-leveraged on complex, poorly understood assets, reported catastrophic losses. The news was a pebble that started an avalanche. The word contagion began to appear in financial reports, a clinical term for sheer, unadulterated panic. Credit markets, the lifeblood of the global economy, froze solid. Lenders stopped lending. Trust evaporated overnight. Clara watched the news with a detached, almost clinical horror. The ticker on the bottom of the screen was a river of red. The numbers weren't just dipping. They were in freefall. The Dow Jones, the S&P 500, the very indices that comprised her simple, elegant orchid strategy, were plummeting by percentages that were normally seen in a year, now happening in a single day. She saw footage of traders on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, their faces masks of stunned disbelief and terror. This wasn't a correction. This was a collapse. Her first instinct was primal. She logged into her brokerage account. The screen that loaded was a vision of financial carnage. The beautiful, upward-curving graph of her net worth was now a sheer cliff face. The $100,000 milestone, that hard-won symbol of her security, was gone, erased as if it had never existed. The number was now $72,000, a loss of $28,000. On paper, but it didn't feel like paper. It felt like a physical blow to her solar plexus. All those envelopes, all those packed lunches, all those walks in the rain. It felt like watching a tidal wave obliterate the fortress she had spent a decade building, the walls dissolving into sand before her eyes. The fear was a living thing, coiling in her gut, whispering terrible truths. Sell. Sell now before it all disappears. You can salvage something. You can get out with $72,000. It's better than nothing. It was the voice of the 32-year-old Clara, the one who felt powerless. It was a seductive voice, promising action, promising an end to the sickening feeling of watching her future vaporize. She picked up the phone. Her finger hovered over the speed dial for Arthur. She needed his calm, his wisdom. She needed him to tell her what to do. But she put the phone down. This was her test. Arthur had given her the map, but she had to walk through this valley of shadows alone. She had to prove that the temperament he had praised was real, that it wasn't just a fair-weather disposition. She closed the brokerage account window. The red numbers were a psychological toxin. She then did the only thing she could think to do that was productive, that was within her control. She opened her blue notebook. She turned to a blank page and wrote at the top, "The storm of year." And then she began to write, not numbers, but principles. She wrote Arthur's words in large, steady letters. The market is a device for transferring money from the impatient to the patient. She wrote, I am an investor, not a speculator. She wrote, I do not need this money today. My time horizon is decades. She wrote the most important one. Volatility is not risk. The real risk is selling low. This was her psychological armor. She was fortifying her mind while the financial world burned. She forced herself to remember the history Arthur had taught her. The Great Depression, the stagflation of the 70s, the dot-com bust. In every single case, the world did not end. The market did not go to zero. It recovered. It always recovered. It took years, sometimes over a decade, but it always climbed back to new heights. This was not a unique apocalypse. It was a particularly vicious turn in a perpetual cycle. The true test came a few days later. Her automatic monthly investment was scheduled to transfer from her checking account to her brokerage. The amount was $300, the accumulated fruit of that month's envelopes. The logic was inescapable, terrifying, and brilliant. The market was on sale. Her $300 would buy far more shares today than it would have a month ago. It was the ultimate act of faith, of contrarian courage. To buy when everyone else was selling in a blind panic felt insane. It felt like throwing her money into a furnace. With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like it contained all the fear in the world, she let the transaction proceed. She did not cancel it. The system, her beautiful, unemotional system, was working exactly as designed. It was buying fear. It was buying despair. It was, in that moment, the hardest thing she had ever done financially. The storm raged for months. The news grew progressively worse. Major institutions that were considered too big to fail did, in fact, fail. The government intervened with unprecedented bailouts, a move that sparked outrage and further panic. The portfolio value on her statements continued to shrink. $72,000 became $65,000. $65,000 became $58,000. She stopped looking. She trusted the system. She focused on what she could control, her job, her spending, her sanity. She took long, contemplative walks. She read novels, not financial news. She practiced the stoic acceptance Arthur had embodied. And then, imperceptibly at first, the free fall stopped. The market didn't bounce back, but it stopped collapsing. It began to move sideways, a pattern of painful, jagged stability. This was the bottom. It was a long, flat, desolate landscape of pessimism. But it was not a cliff. The storm had passed. The winds were still, and the devastation was complete. But Clara was still standing. She had not sold a single share. In fact, she had bought more all the way down. Her share zone column had never been higher. The fortress walls were scarred and battered, but the foundation, built on behavior and temperament, was intact. She had survived the storm not by outrunning it, but by being too heavy, too rooted, too patient for it to carry away. The impatient were being transferred to the patient. And Clara, the quiet orchid in her modest apartment, was one of the patient. The flat, desolate landscape of the market bottom felt, in its own way, more psychologically taxing than the violent plunge. The free fall had been an adrenaline-fueled nightmare, but the stagnation was a slow, grinding ache of despair. The financial news, having exhausted its vocabulary of panic, now settled into a monotone of grim prognostication. The new normal, they called it. Pundits with solemn faces debated whether the very foundations of capitalism had been irreparably damaged, if the long-term growth story was now a relic of a bygone, naive era. For Clara, logging into her brokerage account became a monthly exercise in confronting this new normal. The number would wobble, up a few hundred one month, down 1,000 the next, but it remained stubbornly lodged far below its former peak. The $100,000 mark felt like a distant, mythical memory, a dream from another lifetime. The silence from her investments was deafening. The compounding engine, which had once purred so promisingly, now felt like a cold, dead piece of machinery. This was the period where the true depth of her discipline was tested. It was easy to be patient when the numbers were going up. It was heroic to be patient when they were in free fall. But to be patient during the long, boring, soul-crushing flatline. That was the real work. This was the financial equivalent of watching paint dry on a wall you weren't sure you even wanted anymore. The temptation wasn't to sell and panic anymore. It was to sell out of sheer, weary boredom, to just be done with the whole agonizing, stagnant affair and put the money into something, anything that showed a sign of life. She found herself, once again, turning to the physical artifacts of her journey. She took the old, empty envelope from its drawer. She flipped through the early pages of her blue notebook, with their desperate, cramped handwriting from her pre-envelope days. She looked at the IOU cards from her unemployment, fragile paper testaments to her ability to adapt. These objects were her anchors to reality, reminding her that her entire financial identity was not defined by a single number on a screen at a single point in time. It was defined by a decade of consistent behavior. The system was not broken. It was being stress-tested on its hardest setting. Then, a full year after the collapse, a tiny, green shoot appeared. It was a single, positive trading day. Then another. The gains were small, almost insultingly so, like someone repaying a massive debt with loose change. But they were consistent. The jagged, sideways line on the chart began to develop a faint, almost imperceptible, upward tilt. Clara watched it with the cautious hope of a farmer watching the first sprouts after a long drought. She didn't dare believe it first. It felt like a trick, a bear market rally designed to lure the gullible back in before the next leg down. But the green shoots multiplied. The upward tilt became a gentle slope. The market, it seemed, was not dead. It was convalescing. It was gathering its strength. The new normal began to look a lot like the old process of recovery, just from a much deeper hole. The automated monthly investments she had maintained throughout the storm, the ones that had felt like pouring money into a void, were now being validated. The shares she had bought at the absolute bottom, when fear was at its peak, were now showing substantial paper gains. The very same volatility that had terrified her was now working powerfully in her favor. The rebound, when it truly took hold, was not a slow and steady climb. It was a powerful, surging, almost violent updraft. The market, having been compressed like a spring for so long, exploded upward. The gains that had taken years to accumulate the first time were now being recovered in months, then weeks. Clara's portfolio didn't just recover, it went supernova. The $58,000 became $75,000. $75,000 became $90,000. And then, one ordinary afternoon, it blasted through the $100,000 barrier, not as a milestone to be cautiously approached, but as a mere waypoint on a rapid ascent. It didn't stop there. It kept climbing. $110,000. $120,000. The day her portfolio passed $150,000, Clara finally allowed herself to fully absorb the lesson. She sat at her desk, not with the serene peace of her first $100,000, but with the electrified understanding of a scientist who has just witnessed a fundamental law of nature in action. The lesson was not just that the market recovers. The lesson was that volatility is not the enemy of the long-term investor. It is the source of their alpha. The storm had not been a disaster to be survived. It had been a necessary, albeit terrifying, part of the growth cycle. The brutal decline had created the opportunity. Her unemotional, systematic investing during the panic had allowed her to harness that opportunity. The people who had sold in fear had locked in their losses and missed the entire recovery. They had experienced the risk without any of the reward. She, by holding firm and continuing to invest, had been rewarded for her temperament with a turbocharged version of the compounding she had come to love. This was the final, master-level understanding of her financial education. Risk was not measured by the wild swings of a stock chart. True risk was behavioral. The risk was in being the impatient one, the one who let fear or greed dictate their actions. The risk was in abandoning a sound strategy at the exact moment it was poised to deliver its greatest rewards. The market's dramatic fluctuations were simply the mechanism by which it transferred wealth from those with weak hands to those with steady ones. She thought of Arthur's orchid. The orchid did not panic during a drought. It went dormant. It conserved its resources. It trusted that the rain would return. And when it did, the orchid was ready to bloom more beautifully than ever. She had been the orchid. She had endured the drought. And now she was experiencing the bloom. This hard-won knowledge fundamentally rewired her relationship with money and markets forever. She would never again fear a downturn. She would see it for what it was, a sale, a temporary, often emotionally devastating, but financially lucrative sale on the future of human enterprise. The peace she now felt was different from before. It was not the peace of calm seas. It was the peace of a seasoned captain who knows her ship can weather any storm, and that the storms themselves are what make the journey possible. The fortress had not just been repaired. Its walls had been reinforced with steel forged in the fires of the crash. And Clara knew, with an unshakable certainty that resonated in her very bones, that no market, no headline, no panic could ever breach them again. The student had not just survived the test. She had mastered the subject. The decades that followed the great storm settled into a rhythm of profound, almost predictable growth. Clara's life, like her portfolio, had matured. The frantic energy of her youth had been replaced by a deep, resonant stillness. She was now in her early 60s, her dark hair having gracefully surrendered to an elegant, silver white, often pulled back into a loose bun. The lines on her face were not merely marks of age, but a topographic map of her journey, etched by worry, smoothed by peace, and crinkled at the eyes from a smile that came more readily now. She had never married, a conscious choice that allowed her focus to remain undiluted. Her career had plateaued comfortably at a senior administrative level, a position she held not for ambition, but for the structure and modest, reliable income it provided to continue feeding the system. The shoebox apartment was now a cherished home, filled with books, a few pieces of art collected during mindful travels, and plants that thrived under her patient care. Her life was a masterpiece of quiet intentionality. The envelope ritual had long since been retired, its purpose served. The daily transfer happened automatically, a silent, digital ghost of the physical act that had started it all. The blue notebook was now a historical document, stored in a box with the original, empty envelope and the IOU cards. She no longer needed it. The principles were encoded in her DNA. Her financial life ran with the quiet, perpetual hum of a geothermal plant, powered by the deep, internal heat of compounded returns. She checked her statements quarterly now, with the detached interest of a gardener checking the height of a mature oak tree. The wild swings of the market, which continued their eternal cycle of boom and bust, no longer registered as emotional events. They were simply seasons, winters of fear that made the springs of recovery all the more fruitful. The approach to the seven-figure milestone was so gradual it was almost anticlimactic. There was no frantic countdown, no obsessive checking of the balance. The number had been climbing steadily for years, propelled by the now colossal engine of compounding working on a much larger base. A few percent gain on $100,000 was a nice vacation. A few percent gain on $900,000 was a new car. The growth was absolute, and it was breathtaking in its scale. She had long ago passed the point where her portfolio's annual growth dwarfed her salary. The seed had not just become a tree. It had become a forest that generated its own weather. The moment itself arrived on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. She was 62. It was a cool, crisp autumn morning. She had taken the day off to simply enjoy it, a luxury her younger self could never have conceived. She had slept in, made herself a pot of strong, fragrant tea, and was now puttering on her small balcony, deadheading the spent blossoms from her geraniums. The city below was going about its business, a river of sound and motion that she observed from her quiet eddy. There was no premonition, no sense of cosmic significance. The thought of her portfolio didn't even cross her mind. After tending to the plants, she went inside to wash the soil from her hands. As she dried them on a towel, her gaze fell on her tablet, lying on the kitchen counter. It was the day after the end of the quarter. An old habit, faint as a phantom limb, prompted her to pick it up. She tapped the icon for a brokerage app, her movements slow and unhurried. The login was biometric. Her fingerprint unlocked a fortune. The screen loaded, and there it was, a number with 2 commas. $1,327.41. She stared. She didn't blink. She didn't refresh. She simply stood there, the towel still in her hands, and looked at the number. She waited for the surge of emotion, the triumphant cry, the tears of joy, the urge to call someone, Arthur, her brother, anyone, and proclaim the victory. But the expected tsunami of feeling never arrived. Instead, what washed over her was a silence so profound it seemed to absorb all sound from the world. It was a silence of completion, a feeling of a long, complex, and beautiful mathematical equation finally resolving itself to zero. The chase was over. The goal, pursued for 30 years with a focus that had bordered on obsession, was achieved. And in its achievement, it was instantly demystified. The number on the screen was just a number. It was data. It was not happiness. It was not fulfillment. It was not a personality. It was a tool, a powerful, life-altering tool, but a tool nonetheless. The real treasure, she realized in that crystalline moment, was not the $1 million. The real treasure was the woman she had become in the process of earning it. The $1 million was freedom, yes, but she had been tasting that freedom for years already. It was the freedom to have this quiet Tuesday to herself. The freedom to not worry about a doctor's bill. The freedom to have said no to 100 unreasonable requests at work over the years. The freedom that had allowed her to sleep soundly through every single market crash and geopolitical crisis since the Great Storm. The money was just the certificate of authenticity for a freedom she had already built in her soul, brick by patient brick. She thought of the thousands of $10 bills. She thought of the feeling of that first envelope, so thin and insignificant. She thought of Mark's mocking laughter. She thought of the terror of unemployment and the IOU cards that had kept her spirit alive. She thought of Arthur's gentle wisdom in the orchid house. She thought of the sheer, pants-wetting terror of the market crash and the glacial patience of the recovery. This number on the screen was the sum total of all of it. It was her life, quantified. It was her discipline, her fear, her resilience, her patience, all distilled into a single digital readout. A slow, soft smile, one of deep understanding and release, spread across her face. There were no tears. There was only a quiet, expansive peace. She had not just reached a financial destination. She had completed a spiritual curriculum. The pursuit of the number had been the vehicle for her own transformation from a frightened, reactive girl into a sovereign, unshakable woman. She put the tablet down. She finished drying her hands. She walked back to her balcony, where the autumn sun was now warm on her face. The geraniums, their dead blooms removed, looked vibrant and alive. The city hummed on. Nothing had changed, and everything had changed. The $1 million moment was not an explosion. It was a quiet exhalation after a 30-year-long, deeply satisfying breath. The journey was over, and as she stood there, feeling the sun on her skin, she understood that the real journey, the one of living a life of purpose and peace, was just beginning. The money would now serve that life, quietly and efficiently, from the background. It had done its job. It had made her free. And now, she was finally completely ready to live like it. The weeks following the $1 million milestone were a period of profound and unsettling disorientation for Clara. The central, organizing principle of her adult life, the relentless, disciplined pursuit of financial security, had vanished. The finish line she had crossed was not a gateway to a new, exciting race. It was a vast, open plain of possibility that stretched out in silent, intimidating emptiness. The what now that had whispered to her after her first 100,000 now shouted with the force of void. She had spent 30 years building the fortress. Now she was standing in the center of its immense, silent courtyard, and the quiet was deafening. The machinery of her financial life, once a source of comforting rhythm, now felt like a ghost ship sailing itself, its purpose fulfilled, its captain suddenly redundant. This existential drift manifested in small, peculiar ways. She found herself standing for too long in front of the open refrigerator, not from hunger, but from a lack of any internal directive. She would pick up a book and put it down after a few pages, her concentration scattered. The daily routines that had structured her life felt hollow, like performing a play after the audience had gone home. The freedom she had coveted for so long now felt weightless, directionless, almost burdensome. She realized, with a start, that she had been so focused on achieving the means to live that she had given scant, serious thought to what she actually wanted to live for. The portfolio was a powerful engine, but it was sitting in neutral, and she had forgotten how to drive. A deep, restless melancholy began to set in. She had achieved a goal that was statistically remarkable, a testament to human discipline and the power of compound interest. And yet, she felt curiously empty. The money was a tool, as she had recognized on her balcony, but she had no project for the tool. She had won her freedom, but she was standing at the edge of the prison gates, paralyzed by the sheer scope of the outside world. The chase had been her identity. Without it, who was she? It was during this period of quiet crisis that a memory surfaced, vivid and unbidden. It was from the personal finance workshop where she had met Arthur, all those years ago. A woman, overwhelmed and in tears, had spoken about her paralyzing fear of debt. Clara, then just starting her own journey, had felt a surge of empathy, but also of helplessness. She had no wisdom to offer. Now, she had nothing but wisdom. She had lived the solution. The thought was a small, bright spark in the fog of her listlessness. The following Saturday, on a whim, she went back to the community center where the workshop had been held. It looked the same, smelled the same, of old wood floors and faintly of bleach. A flyer on a bulletin board announced a financial literacy for single parents class starting the following week. She stood there, reading it, and felt the first genuine pull of purpose she had felt in weeks. This was not about money anymore. This was about meaning. She contacted the program coordinator, a weary but kind-faced woman named Maria. Clara didn't lead with her financial status. She simply said she had spent a long time learning how to manage a tight budget and dig herself out of a hole, and she wondered if she could be of any help. Maria, seeing the quiet sincerity in Clara's eyes, signed her up as a volunteer on the spot. The first class was a revelation. She stood before a small group of tired, anxious men and women, their faces mirrors of her own past desperation. She didn't use a PowerPoint presentation or complex charts. She brought her blue notebook. She held it up, its worn cover a testament to its use. This, she said, her voice clear and calm in the quiet room, was my map out of the wilderness. It started with one question: where does the money go? She didn't talk about index funds or asset allocation. She talked about the power of a single, conscious choice. She told them about the envelope, not as a magic trick, but as a psychological tool. She explained how the physical act of setting aside a small, non-threatening amount of money every day wasn't about getting rich. It was about proving to yourself, daily, that you were in control. She saw light bulbs going on in people's eyes. She saw the shift from helplessness to agency. She worked one-on-one with a young mother named Letitia, who was drowning in payday loan debt. Clara didn't judge. She simply sat with her, with a calculator and a notepad, and they built a brutal, honest budget together. They found $80 a month to start repaying the most predatory loan. It was a pittance, but to Letitia, it was a lifeline. It was hope. The day Letitia made her first payment and texted Clara a picture of the confirmation screen, Clara felt a surge of pure, unadulterated joy that the sight of her seven-figure portfolio had never, ever elicited. This was the missing piece. This was the different kind of wealth. The money in her accounts was potential energy. But the act of sharing her knowledge, of turning her hard-won scars into a guide for others, was kinetic. It was energy in motion. It was purpose. The emptiness inside her began to fill, not with the passive accumulation of digits, but with the active currency of human connection and empowerment. She started teaching a regular class, the first step from fear to control. She used simple, relatable metaphors. Debt was a fog. The budget was a map. The envelope was a compass. She became the Arthur for a new generation of strugglers. She saw in their eyes the same fear and hope she had once carried, and in helping them, she healed the last remnants of that fearful young woman within herself. Her own relationship with money softened, matured. It was no longer a fortress to be defended, but a river to be channeled for good. She started quietly paying for a struggling student's GED class. She anonymously covered a month's rent for a family in her building facing eviction. The money, which had been an abstract number, became a tangible force for alleviating fear in the world. And in doing so, it completed its own transformation from a source of her anxiety to an instrument of her profoundest peace. Clara Evans, the millionaire, had finally found her true wealth. It was the light in a student's eyes when they understood their budget, the relieved slump of a parent's shoulders when they saw a path forward, and the deep, resonant satisfaction of knowing that her journey could now light the way for others. The fortress had become a sanctuary, and she, its gentle, steadfast keeper. The change of seasons in the city was something Clara had come to appreciate with the acute sensitivity of someone who now had the time to notice. The sharp, clean light of autumn had given way to the low, honeyed sun of early winter, casting long, dramatic shadows across the buildings. She was arranging a vase of winter branches on her coffee table, a simple pleasure, when the phone rang. The caller ID showed her brother's name. A flicker of the old, familiar tension, a ghost of a feeling, passed through her, but it was faint, almost academic. She answered. Clara. Mark's voice was different. The polished, performative confidence was gone, sanded away by something that sounded like exhaustion. There was no jovial greeting, no subtle jab about her apartment or her life. I was wondering if I could come by. I need to talk to you. Of course, Mark, she said, her voice calm. Now is fine. When he arrived, the change in him was startling. The man who had always presented himself as the epitome of success now looked diminished. His expensive overcoat seemed to hang on him. The carefully styled hair was thinner, less meticulously arranged. The lines on his face were no longer markers of character, but of strain. He moved into her apartment, not with his usual air of appraisal, but with the weary shuffle of a supplicant. He declined her offer of tea and simply stood in the middle of her living room, looking lost. It's all gone, Clara, he said, the words coming out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back for a long time. The last deal, it was supposed to be the big one, the one that set us up for good. But the market turned, the investors pulled out. I'm over-leveraged. The bank is calling the loans on the investment properties. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure desperation she had never seen in him before. I'm looking at bankruptcy. At 65, we might lose the house. Janice, she doesn't even know the half of it yet. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were those of a frightened boy. The cynic, the mocker, the master of the universe, was gone. In his place was a man facing the ruin of everything his identity was built upon. I've been chasing it my whole life, he whispered, his voice cracking. The big score, the deal that would make me a king. And I was always just one deal away. I made so much money, Clara, and I have nothing to show for it. Nothing real. It all just flowed through my hands. He gestured vaguely, a sweeping motion that encompassed a lifetime of chasing phantoms. I was so busy making money, I never learned how to keep it. I never learned how to just hold on to it. He sank onto her sofa, the fight gone out of him. That day I came here, all those years ago, I laughed at you. I called you cheap. I told you that you couldn't save your way to rich. He let out a short, bitter laugh that was more like a sob. My God, Clara, I was such a fool. You weren't just saving money. You were building something. Something that couldn't be taken away by a bad deal or a market crash. I was building a house of cards. You were pouring a foundation of granite. He looked around her apartment, really seeing it for the first time. He saw the quiet quality of the furniture, the well-cared-for plants, the peace that permeated the space. He saw the absence of fear. "You were right," he said, the words clearly costing him a great deal. It wasn't about the $10. It was about the habit, the muscle. "I never built that muscle. I only built debt." Clara listened in silence, her heart filled not with schadenfreude, but with a profound, aching pity. This was the logical conclusion of the path he had chosen, the path she had rejected. His storm had finally hit, and he had no fortress, no system, no discipline to see him through. He had only his own crumbling reputation and a mountain of debt. She didn't say, "I told you so." There was no victory in this. There was only tragedy. She went to the kitchen and made him a cup of tea anyway, placing on the coffee table in front of him. She sat in the chair opposite him. "Mark," she said, her voice soft but firm, "the past is the past. Right now, you need a plan. Not a big, flashy plan. A small, simple first-step plan." He looked at her, a flicker of his old skepticism returning. "A plan? Clara, you don't understand the scale of this. I understand that big problems are solved by breaking them down into small, manageable pieces," she interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. It was the voice she used with her students at the community center. "You don't fix a collapsed building by staring at the rubble. You start by clearing one piece of debris at a time." She got up, went to her desk, and came back with a simple, ruled notepad and a pen. She placed them in front of him. It was an echo of her own beginning. "The first thing you need is a financial autopsy," she said, using the term from her own blue notebook. "You need to know the exact numbers. Every debt, every asset, every single monthly expense. No more hiding from it. The truth is your only way out." He stared at the blank page as if it were a snake. I don't know if I can." "You can," Clara said, "because you have to, and you're not going to do it alone." She took a fresh envelope from her desk drawer. It was plain and white, identical to the one she had started with. She placed it on top of the notepad. "And when you're ready, you can start with this. Not with thousands of dollars. Start with 10, just $10 a day. To prove to yourself that you can still be in control of something. To build the muscle." Mark looked from the notepad to the envelope, and then back to his sister's face. The cynicism was gone, replaced by a dawning, humbled comprehension. He was not being offered a bailout. He was being offered a blueprint. The same blueprint he had mocked decades ago. It was the only thing left that could possibly save him. He picked up the envelope. It was weightless, but he held it as if it were made of lead. A single tear traced a path through the stubble on his cheek and fell onto the paper. It was the tear of a proud man whose world had collapsed, finally being offered not a handout, but the tools to rebuild. I'll try," he whispered. "That's all it is, Mark," Clara said gently. "It's all any of us can do. One day at a time. One choice at a time. One envelope at a time." The student had become the teacher, and the teacher had, in this moment of profound reversal, achieved her most unlikely and most meaningful conversion. The fortress she had built was not just a shelter for herself. Its gates were open, offering sanctuary to the very cynic who had once stood outside, mocking its walls. The reconciliation with Mark, though born from his despair, planted a new seed in Clara's mind. Watching her brother, a man in his 60s, struggle to grasp the basic concepts of a budget, of living within his means, of the psychological power of a simple envelope, was a stark reminder. It wasn't just about the math. It was about a way of being in the world, a relationship with money and the future that had to be cultivated, preferably not in the ruins of one's life. Her work at the community center was deeply fulfilling, but it was reactive. She was helping people who were already in crisis, already drowning. What about those who hadn't yet stepped into the water? What about the next generation, growing up in a world of even more pervasive consumerism and instant gratification than she had? The thought crystallized during a conversation with her niece, Sarah, Mark's daughter. She was a bright, ambitious college senior, about to graduate into a world of staggering student debt and a competitive job market. She was visiting Clara, a newfound respect in her eyes after witnessing her father's humbling and her aunt's quiet strength. They were talking about her plans, her anxieties. "I just don't see how it's possible," Sarah confessed, swirling the tea in her mug. "Everyone I know is leveraged to the hilt. Student loans, car payments, credit card debt from just living. It feels like the game is rigged from the start. The only way to win is to not play. But how do you do that?" Clara looked at this young woman, on the cusp of her life, already feeling the weight of the financial trap closing around her. She saw herself at 22, full of fear and without a map. She had been given no manual. She had to write her own, in a blue notebook, through trial and error and sheer force of will. Sarah didn't need to start from scratch. She could be given a head start. The legacy wouldn't be just the money. It would be the system, the wisdom. "Let me show you a different game," Clara said softly. She didn't launch into a lecture. She told Sarah's story. She told her about the late nights and the blue glow of the laptop, the feeling of being trapped. She told her about the first envelope and how silly it felt. She spoke not in the language of finance, but in the language of emotion, of fear, of control, of empowerment. She explained the orchid strategy Arthur had taught her, the power of being boring and consistent in a world that screams for flashy and fast. Sarah listened, her intelligent eyes taking it all in. It wasn't a get-rich-quick scheme. It was a philosophy, a way of life. And to a young woman drowning in a sea of financial anxiety, it sounded like a life raft. "But the debt," Sarah said, her voice small. "It feels like a mountain." "Mountains are climbed one step at a time," Clara replied. "And you don't have to carry the whole weight of it on your back every day. You just have to carry that day's step." Later that evening, after Sarah had left, inspired and armed with a list of book recommendations and a promise to start her own financial autopsy, Clara went to her desk. She opened her brokerage account, the interface now as familiar to her as an old friend. But this time, she wasn't looking at her own holdings. She navigated to the section for opening new accounts. She was going to create a 529 college savings plan, but not for a child, for her unborn grandniece or nephew, for Sarah's future children. And then she stopped. This felt too distant, too abstract. The help was needed now. Sarah needed to build her own foundation, her own muscle memory of discipline, before she could ever effectively build a future for others. So, Clara did something different. She created a new, separate investment account. She titled it simply, the Legacy Fund. She didn't fund it with a massive, lump sum inheritance. That would bypass the entire point, short-circuiting the learning process. It would be just another form of a windfall, devoid of the struggle that gave it meaning. Instead, she set up a new automated transfer, not from her own wealth, but as a symbolic, parallel action. She set it to transfer $10 every single day into the legacy fund for Sarah. The next day, she invited Sarah over again. She showed her the new account on the screen. "This is for you," Clara said, "but it's not a gift you can spend. Not yet. It's a lesson." Sarah looked confused. "A lesson?" "Watch it," Clara instructed. "Log in once a month. Don't look at the dollar value. Look at the share zone column. Watch that number grow. I'm going to keep putting $10 in here every day, rain or shine, mark it up or mark it down. I want you to see what happens. I want you to see the boring, magical, powerful result of doing one small, consistent thing over and over again for years." She was giving Sarah the one thing she herself had never had, a living, breathing, real-time example of the system in motion, funded by someone else's discipline, so she could observe its effects without the paralyzing fear of losing her own money. It was a financial greenhouse where the orchid of disciplined investing could be nurtured before being planted in the harsher climate of her own financial life. "This is the real inheritance, Sarah," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's not the money in this account. It's the understanding of what this money represents. It represents time. It represents patience. It represents the power you have to build your own future, not with a lottery ticket, but with 1,000 deliberate, quiet choices. The envelopes I started with are gone, but the habit they created is now a river, and this She pointed to the screen, is a new tributary. For you. Sarah stared at the screen, at the first $10 investment, and then back at her aunt. The abstract philosophy had just been made stunningly concrete. She wasn't being given a fish. She was being given a front row seat to a master class in how to build a fishing rod, tend the pond, and wait for the fish to multiply on their own. In that moment, Clara understood the final, complete form of her wealth. It was a triple-stranded cord. The first strand was her own unshakable security and freedom. The second was the purpose she found in guiding others out of the wilderness, as she did at the community center and with her brother. And now, the third, and perhaps most enduring strand, the legacy of wisdom, passed not as a dry lecture, but as a living, growing, financial organism that her niece could watch, learn from, and eventually take ownership of. The $10 habit had come full circle. It had saved her. It was saving her brother. And now, it was being encoded into the future, a quiet, persistent rhythm that would outlive her, beating in the heart of the next generation. The fortress had become a school, and its most important lesson was just beginning. The final, seamless integration of wealth into Clara's identity did not arrive with a grand pronouncement, but rather, it seeped into the marrow of her daily existence like a gentle, perpetual dawn. The striving was over. The frantic energy that had once fueled her pursuit of financial goals had been entirely replaced by a state of being that could only be described as profound contentment. It was a climate of the soul, independent of external weather. She was now 65, and her life had settled into a rhythm that was both simple and immeasurably rich. The small, paid-off apartment was no longer a shoebox, but a perfectly calibrated vessel for her happiness. Every object within it chosen for utility or beauty, nothing existing out of obligation or the need to project an image. Her days were not dictated by an alarm clock, but by the sun and her own internal rhythms. She had negotiated a gentle retirement from her job, not with a party, but with a quiet handshake and the deep satisfaction of a job well and consistently done. Her time was now her own, and she spent it with the same intentionality she had once applied to her budget. Mornings were for silence and a slow pot of tea, often on her balcony, where she watched the city wake up. She had taken up sketching, not with any ambition to become an artist, but for the pure, meditative focus it required, the feeling of the charcoal against the rough paper, the attempt to truly see the shape of a leaf or the play of light on a building. Afternoons were for reading, for long, ambling walks through different neighborhoods, or for her work at the community center, which had become the social and emotional core of her life. She was no longer just a teacher there. She was an elder, a steady presence, a living testament to the principles she taught. The money, the mighty engine she had built, was now a silent, invisible partner in her life. It required no maintenance, no anxious checking. It simply was. The automated systems she had set up decades ago continued their flawless operation. The compounding machine now, so vast and powerful that its growth in a single year could have funded her entire lifestyle for a decade. It had transcended being a number and had become a fundamental, unshakable law of her universe, as reliable as gravity. The fear of not having enough, a specter that had haunted her for the first half of her life, was not just gone. It was an impossible concept, a forgotten language. This contentment was not passive. It was an active state of appreciation. She found immense pleasure in things that cost nothing. The perfect crispness of an autumn day. The deep, complex flavor of a soup she had simmered for hours. The feeling of a well-worn book in her hands. The genuine connection with a student at the center when a complex financial concept finally clicked into place. These were the currencies of her rich life. She had discovered the great, hidden paradox. By relentlessly focusing on financial capital for 30 years, she had ultimately freed herself to fully appreciate all the forms of non-financial capital that made life worth living. Time, health, friendship, peace, and purpose. One afternoon, she found herself walking through a high-end department store, a place she hadn't entered in years. She moved through the perfumed aisles, past glittering jewelry counters and mannequins draped in luxurious fabrics. It was like visiting a museum of a civilization she no longer belonged to. She watched other women her age, their faces often tight with a kind of determined acquisition, and felt not judgment, but a wave of compassion. They were still playing a game she had resigned from. A saleswoman approached her, sensing a potential customer. "Can I help you find something beautiful today?" she asked, her smile polished. Clara smiled back, a genuine, peaceful smile. "I'm just browsing the beauty," she said, and meant it. She wasn't looking at the objects as things to be owned, but as artifacts of certain worldview. A handbag cost more than her first car. A watch could have funded a year of her community center classes. The numbers were abstract and meaningless to her now. She felt no desire, no envy, no sense of lack. She possessed something far more valuable than anything in the store, the absolute certainty that she wanted for nothing. She left the store empty-handed and stepped out into the afternoon sun. The light felt warmer on her skin, the air clearer in her lungs. The act of not buying, of walking away from a world of luxury without a single backward glance of longing, felt more powerful than any purchase she could have made. It was the ultimate expression of her freedom. She was not defined by what she owned, but by what she had the power to walk away from. Her social life, too, had been refined by this contentment. She had let fade the friendships based on gossip or shared complaining. Her circle was small now, consisting of a few deep, authentic connections, people like Arthur, with whom she still had monthly lunches, and a couple of fellow volunteers from the center whose values aligned with her own. Their conversations were about ideas, about books, about the small, good things in their lives. There was no posturing, no competition. They were fellow travelers on the path of a mindful life. In the evenings, she would often sit in her favorite chair by the window, a soft blanket over her knees, and simply watch the city lights come on, one by one. There was no urgency, no need to be anywhere else, do anything else, or become anyone else. The journey was complete. The woman who had once cried over a spreadsheet in a dim apartment was a story she told her students, a character from a book she had read long ago. The striving had forged her, but the contentment was her reward. She had not just reached a financial destination. She had arrived at a state of grace. The noise of the world, the ads, the social pressures, the endless drumbeat of more, had faded to a distant hum, and in the vast, quiet space it left behind, Clara Evans had finally found the sound of her own, perfectly contented soul. It was the richest silence in the world. The first frost of the season had silvered the world outside Clara's window, etching delicate, crystalline patterns on the glass. Inside, a single lamp cast a warm, golden pool of light in the growing dusk of the late afternoon. The heating system clicked on with a soft, familiar hum, another small, automated comfort in a life now defined by them. On this particular evening, a quiet, reflective mood had settled over Clara. It was the anniversary of her layoff, all those decades ago, a date that had once been seared in her memory as a day of terror, but which now felt like a distant, almost benevolent turning point. It was a day that had forced a beginning. Driven by this reflective impulse, she went to the back of her bedroom closet and retrieved a small, archival cardboard box. It was something she hadn't opened in years. She carried it to her living room, placing it on the coffee table with a soft thud. Dust motes, disturbed from their long slumber, danced in the lamplight. She lifted the lid. Inside was the physical history of her journey, a time capsule of her former selves. On top lay her blue notebook. She lifted it out. Its cloth cover faded to a soft gray blue, the spine cracked from years of use. She opened it carefully. The first page, Financial Autopsy, was written in the frantic, sharp script of a terrified woman. She could still feel the ghost of that panic, a cold echo in her bones. She flipped through the pages, watching her handwriting evolve, from desperate and cramped to measured and analytical, and finally, to the calm, expansive script of her later plans and philosophical notes. Here were the grocery lists, the calculations for bus fare versus walking, the crisis mode pages from her unemployment, filled with a grim determination that now felt heroic. It was the logbook of a long and arduous voyage. Beneath the notebook was a smaller bundle, tied with a simple piece of twine. It was the stack of IOU cards from her lean months. She untied it and fanned them out on the table. The ink was slightly faded, the cards soft at the edges. Day 47, $10. Save by mending coat button, EST $15 tailoring. $5 for button equals $10. Day 81, $10. Save by using library internet for job search instead of cafe. Each card was a tiny, paper monument to resilience, to the refusal to let a broken system break her spirit. They were not records of deprivation, but of incredible creativity and strength. She traced the handwriting with her finger, a salute to the woman who had found a way to keep the faith when all external evidence argued for despair. And then, at the very bottom of the box, was the original envelope. It was so worn it was almost fabric-like, the white dulled to the color of old parchment. The edges were rounded and soft, and the flap was permanently creased from being tucked and untucked thousands of times. She picked it up. It was weightless, empty, a shed skin, but holding it was the most powerful experience of the evening. This simple, paper rectangle was the talisman. It was the physical locus where the abstract decision to change her life had been made manifest, day after day after day. She sat back, surrounded by these artifacts, and let the memories wash over her. She didn't just remember the events. She remembered the feelings. The cold sweat of fear, the burning shame of her brother's mockery, the dizzying vertigo of the market crash. But she also remembered the first flicker of control when she placed that first $10 bill inside the envelope. The solid satisfaction of her first automated investment. The serene awe of understanding compound interest not as a theory, but as a personal force. The profound peace of the $1,000,000 moment. And the deep, warm fulfillment of teaching Letitia, of reconciling with Mark, of mentoring Sarah. She saw now, with the perfect clarity of hindsight, that every single part of the journey had been necessary. The fear had been the fuel. The doubt had been the whetstone that sharpened her resolve. The lean years had taught her adaptability. The market crash had taught her the supreme value of temperament. Even Mark's cynicism had been a gift, forcing her to define and defend her philosophy, hardening it against the world's scorn. It wasn't a straight line. It was a spiral. She kept circling back to the same core lessons, but each time at a higher level of understanding. The envelope was about control. The budget was about clarity. The investing was about faith in the future. The mentoring was about purpose. And the contentment was the final, integrated understanding of it all. She thought about the nature of wealth. The world defined it as a number in a bank account. She had learned that true wealth was the sum total of your options and your peace of mind. It was the ability to walk away from a toxic job, a stressful situation, or a high-pressure sale without a second thought. It was the silence where anxiety used to live. It was the time to sit on a frosty evening and look back on a life well built, without a single regret for the path taken. The artifacts on the table were not just mementos. They were proof. Proof that a life could be deliberately architected. Proof that ordinary, consistent actions, repeated over time, could produce extraordinary results. Proof that the most powerful force in the universe wasn't just compound interest, but compound behavior. She carefully gathered the IOU cards, retied them, and placed them back in the box. She closed the blue notebook and laid it on top. Finally, she placed the empty, worn envelope on the very top, the first and last piece of the puzzle. She closed the lid. She wasn't putting the past away. She was integrating it. These weren't ghosts to be locked away. They were the foundation upon which her present peace was built. The fearful woman, the struggling woman, the determined woman, they were all still part of her, but they were no longer in charge. They had built the throne upon which the contented woman now sat. Clara stood up and walked to the window. The frost patterns were more intricate now, a silent, beautiful explosion of geometry on the glass. The world outside was quiet and still. She felt a deep, resonant harmony between the frozen peace outside and the warm peace within. Looking back was not an act of nostalgia. It was an act of gratitude. Gratitude for the struggle. Gratitude for the lessons. And most of all, gratitude for the simple, worn, empty envelope that had started it all. The journey of $1 million had begun with a single, deliberate choice to believe in a different future and the courage to build it, one $10 bill at a time. The rhythm of Clara's life had become as natural and unforced as the changing of the seasons outside her window. She moved through her days with a graceful economy of motion, each action imbued with a quiet purpose. The frantic striving of her youth, the grim determination of her middle years, had all been refined into this state of profound, active serenity. At 68, her hair was a magnificent, cloud-like cap of silver white, and her face, while lined, seemed to radiate a soft light from within, as if the peace she had cultivated for decades had become a physical property. She still kept the ritual, though its form had evolved once more. The physical envelope was a relic in a box. The automated transfers were silent, digital ghosts. The ritual now was one purely of spirit, a daily, conscious acknowledgement of the abundance that flowed through her life, both financial and otherwise. This particular evening felt different, charged with a quiet significance she couldn't name. It was as if the air in her apartment was thicker, more resonant. She had spent a day at the community center, coaching a young couple through the terrifying but exhilarating process of creating their first realistic budget. Seeing the hope dawn in their eyes, the same hope she had once clutched so desperately, filled her with a deep, warm satisfaction. It was her true work, her ministry. As dusk began to paint the sky in shades of violet and rose, she felt the familiar, gentle pull of her evening ritual. It was no longer about money, but about connection to her past, to her principles, to the steady, unwavering system that had gifted her this life. She went to her desk, not to a laptop, but to the single, shallow drawer where she kept her current stationery. From a fresh box, she took out one plain, white business envelope, identical in every way to the very first one she had bought in a moment of desperate hope nearly 4 decades prior. She didn't reach for a $10 bill. That part of the cycle was complete. Instead, she took her favorite fountain pen, a simple, well-balanced instrument that felt like an extension of her own hand. She uncapped it, the sound a soft, precise click in the quiet room. On the front of the envelope, in her now elegant, flowing script, she did not write a date. She wrote a single word, gratitude. Then, she began to write on a small piece of creamy, high-quality paper she kept for letters. Today, she wrote, I am grateful for the following 10 deposits of wealth that have nothing to do with money. Her pen moved steadily, without pause. The trust in the young couple's eyes at the center today. The perfect, crisp taste of the apple one had with my lunch. The warmth of the sun on my face during my afternoon walk. The memory of Arthur's voice, still clear in my mind, explaining the orchid strategy. The profound silence of this apartment, a silence earned and cherished. The health in my body that allows me to climb the stairs to this home. The knowledge that my brother is, for the first time, sleeping without financial terror. The sight of a sparrow building a nest outside my window, a creature also building its future, one twig at a time. The feeling of this pen in my hand, a tool for creation, not fear. The simple, overwhelming gift of this present moment, free from want, free from fear, brimming with peace. She signed it not with her name, but with a small, simple drawing of an orchid. She folded the note carefully, slid it into the envelope, and tucked the flap inside. It was a different kind of deposit, a different kind of savings account. She was compounding gratitude, and the interest it paid was a deepening, ever-expanding joy. She carried the envelope to the bedroom. She didn't open the drawer with the archival box. That was a museum. This was a living practice. She had a small, lacquered box on her dresser, a beautiful object she had bought not for its price, but for its perfect simplicity. It held a few pieces of cherished jewelry, and now it would hold this. She opened the lid and placed the new envelope inside, on top of a small, growing stack of identical envelopes, each one labeled gratitude and containing a record of a day's non-financial abundance. This was the final, evolved form of the habit. It had begun as a desperate act of financial control. It had morphed into a disciplined engine of wealth creation. It had served as psychological armor during storms. And now, in the autumn of her life, it had blossomed into its truest purpose, a daily, sacred ritual of acknowledging the profound richness of a life well lived. The $10 habit had been the seed. The $1 million portfolio was the strong, towering tree that had grown from it. But this practice of depositing gratitude was the sweet, enduring fruit. She stood for a moment, her hand resting on the closed lacquer box. There was no fanfare, no sense of an ending, only a sense of perfect, seamless continuity. The ritual had never been about the money. The money had been the training wheels, the tangible metric for a deeper, spiritual principle, that small, consistent, daily actions create an immeasurable legacy. She had simply switched metrics from dollars to moments of grace. She looked at her reflection in the dresser mirror. The eyes that looked back were calm, clear, and held a light that no market crash could ever extinguish. She saw the young woman, the middle-aged warrior, and the serene elder, all integrated into one complete person. The journey was the destination. The final envelope was not an end, but a testament to a system so perfect, so resilient, that could even transcend the very medium that had given it birth. It was no longer about building a fortune. It was about inhabiting a state of perpetual, grateful abundance. And as she turned out the light and walked towards her bedroom, Clara Evans knew, with a certainty that was the greatest wealth of all, that the ritual would continue, in one form or another, for all the days of her life. The final chapter of Clara's story was not written in a dramatic flourish, but in the quiet, persistent echoes of the life she had lived. She was 75 now, and her pace had slowed, a gentle deceleration that felt like a natural and welcome transition. Her world had physically shrunk to the confines of her apartment and the nearby community center, but it had expanded infinitely in its depth and resonance. The fierce independence of her younger years had softened into a graceful interdependence with her small, chosen community. She was a fixed point, a calm eye in the ever-turning storm of the city, and people were drawn to that calm. The legacy she had so carefully planted was no longer a sapling she needed to tend. It was a forest generating its own ecosystem. She received these updates not as validations of her own success, but as the most beautiful interest her life's work could have ever paid. They were quiet ripples, spreading out from the single pebble she had dropped into the water 43 years ago. One crisp morning, her niece Sarah, now a confident woman in her mid-30s with a calm authority that reminded Clara of her own younger self, came to visit. She didn't come with questions or crises. She came with a statement. "Aunt Clara," she said, placing a tablet on the coffee table. On the screen was a portfolio statement. It wasn't Clara's. It was Sarah's. The number was not in the millions, but it was substantial, healthy, and, most importantly, it had been built steadily, without drama, over more than a decade. "I hit a milestone this week," Sarah said, her voice steady but her eyes shining with a profound pride. "It's not about the number. It's that I finally feel it. I finally understand what you meant. The money isn't the point. The peace is the point. I look at this, and I don't see a car or a vacation. I see options. I see freedom." Clara listened, her heart swelling with a quiet, boundless joy. This was the true inheritance, not the legacy fund account she had started for Sarah, which had been a teaching tool, but the system that Sarah had internalized. The baton had been passed, not just accepted, but grasped firmly and run with. Later that week, she had a scheduled lunch with her brother, Mark. The transformation in him was now complete and solidified. The desperate, broken man who had appeared in her doorway a decade prior was gone. In his place was a humbler, quieter, and infinitely more grounded man. He was working as a part-time consultant, a role that utilized his people skills without the high-stakes leverage that had nearly destroyed him. He had downsized his life, not as a punishment, but as a liberation. "Janice and I are debt-free," he told her over soup, his voice matter-of-fact, but the wonder of the statement still lingered in his eyes. "The house is small, but it's ours. Actually ours. We paid off the mortgage last month." He shook his head, a slow, amazed smile spreading across his face. "I spent 50 years building a persona on a foundation of sand. It took losing everything to learn how to build a life on rock. You show me the blueprint, Clara. I finally had to read it." He didn't thank her with grand words. The simple, shared understanding between them was a deeper gratitude than any speech. He was another ripple, a life course-corrected, a soul who had found peace not in spite of his failure, but because of it, and because of the steady, non-judgmental hand his sister had extended. At the community center, her role had evolved once more. She was less a teacher now and more a living legend, a source of quiet wisdom. The young couple she had coached years ago now had a child, and they had just bought their first home, a modest, affordable starter house they had saved for with the same envelope system discipline she had taught them. They brought her a picture, their faces beaming with a pride that was about more than real estate. It was about self-reliance. They were another ripple. Her own financial life was a masterpiece of automation and quiet purpose. The vast majority of her portfolio's growth was now donated. It flowed out as silently as it flowed in, funding scholarships for single parents at the community center, supporting financial literacy programs in underserved schools, providing emergency grant for families facing a sudden, crippling expense. The money was a river, and she was merely its steward, channeling it to where it could dam up fear and create pools of opportunity. She received no public recognition for this, and she wanted none. The act of giving was its own reward, the final, perfect expression of the power she had spent a lifetime building. One evening, as she sat in her chair by the window, she thought not of the past, but of the future. She thought of Sarah's future children, who would grow up in a home where financial peace was the air they breathed. She thought of the hundreds of students who had passed through her classes, each one carrying a small piece of her methodology into their own lives, into their families, into their communities. She thought of the quiet, anonymous donations that were, at this very moment, preventing someone else's 2:17 a.m. panic attack. Her story would never be a best-selling book or a viral documentary. It was too quiet, too slow, too undramatic. There were no shocking twists, no lottery wins, no meteoric rises. It was a story of $10, of patience, of a single, consistent rhythm held for a lifetime. But in that quiet, she knew, was its immense power. It was a replicable story. It was a story anyone could start, at any time, with whatever their $10 happened to be. It was a story that proved that the greatest fortunes are built not in the shouting of the trading floor, but in the silence of a daily decision. That the most formidable fortresses are constructed not from windfalls, but from the patient laying of one small, disciplined brick after another. Clara Evans closed her eyes, a soft smile on her lips. The city lights twinkled below, a universe of other stories, other struggles, other quiet triumphs. Her own story was ending, but the ripples she had created were just beginning their journey across the water, touching shores she would never see, in a future she had helped to make more secure, more peaceful, and more free. She had built her fortress, and then, with quiet, relentless grace, she had left the gates open, allowing her hard-won peace to flow out into the world, a quiet, enduring ripple in the vast human ocean.